The Building Homes and Jobs Act, or SB2, as we industry insiders like to call it, went into effect on January 1st, 2018. So it's a little over 3 years old now. I definitely know what that's like. It's not brand new. It's been around for a little while, but not so long that everyone is familiar with it. And it's still an unpleasant surprise to some homeowners and some borrowers when they find the fee for the first time that they might not have been prepared for. It adds a $75 fee to recordings with a few notable and important exceptions. So finding that on your title invoice can be definitely an unpleasant surprise, an unplanned expense. So this episode is all about what that SB2 fee is, when it's applicable and when it's not, and a few key things to know about how the fee is applied. One quick note, it feels like in some ways an increase of recording fees, but in fact it really isn't, and there are some important differences between the $75 charge with SB2 and the recording fees. The main difference is going to be the recording fees are set and controlled by the individual counties and collected for the benefit of those counties. But SB2, on the other hand, is set by the state and controlled by the state, and even though the county recorders are collecting it when they're recording the documents, it's for the benefit of the state, of statewide initiatives to support and develop affordable and low-income housing initiatives and projects. So without further ado, let's get right into the definition of SB2, when it applies, and a few key sort of traps to avoid falling into to make sure that you don't end up paying more on this fee than you were expecting. So we've touched on the very basics of SB2, but just to lay it right out there, SB2 creates a new $75 fee per parcel, per document, per transaction added to recordings that pertain to real property, up to a maximum of $225. And there are exceptions that are actually quite common that we'll dive to in depth in the next section. But basically, anything that's a sale of real property or anything going to an owner-occupant are the key exceptions to being required to pay this $75 fee. The money, as I've mentioned, is entirely meant for affordable housing and low-income housing across the state of California. It's really that simple, but there are a few intricacies in how documents are viewed and looked at that it's important to be aware of in order to accurately predict how much money you're going to end up paying through SB2. One of the key things to be aware of is documents really with "and" in the title. That's not a hard and fast rule, but they tend to be multiple document titles, such as deed of trust and assignment of rents, or substitution of trustee and full reconveyance, the most common instrument for releasing the deed of trust that secures a mortgage. These are important because while they are one physical document, they are looked at by the state and the county as two documents. So even if you're just recording one deed of trust and assignment of rents, it's seen as a deed of trust and an assignment of rents, two separate documents. It'll affect the recorder fees, which tend to be much lower than SB2, but it will also affect the SB2 fee itself, which will go from $75 to $150. $75 for the deed of trust, $75 for the assignment of rents. Same for the sub and recon. The other key thing to be aware of is documents that deal with more than one property at once. It's actually somewhat common to see a deed of trust that secures a debt against more than one property, cross-collateralizes, or a grant deed that transfers multiple properties, like a bundle of land, or often you'll see a residence going along with an adjacent parcel of vacant land. or sometimes even two houses being gifted together. So same kind of thing. In the eyes of SB2, this is looked at as a different transaction for each parcel. So if you have a grant deed that is transferring two different pieces of land, if it's not exempt from any other reason, then you're going to have a $75 charge per parcel of land being transferred along with that deed. Simple enough with the exception of those more sort of detailed instances. Our next section is going to be all about when recordings are exempt from the $75 fee under SB2. Like I've promised, there are exceptions to SB2, and like I mentioned, they are not that rare and not really that difficult to understand either. The first major exception to the requirement to pay the $75 fee under SB2 is a document that is subject to documentary transfer tax. And then a closely related exemption would be any document recorded in connection with a document subject to doc transfer tax, DTT. So documentary transfer tax is the tax that is paid when a parcel is being sold for value. So what this exception basically means is that when you have a sale of real property, the deed for that sale and the other recorded documents connected to the sale are actually going to be exempt from that SB2 fee. Now, typically your DTT is going to be higher, but at least in these cases, SB2 isn't increasing the amount of money that the buyers and sellers need to pay through purchase transactions. The other major exception is documents that either have the effect or are recorded in connection with a document that has the effect of transferring residential property to an owner-occupant. So it does cover a gift to someone who's going to live in the home, but what's much more common is changing the vesting on someone's primary residence. For instance, putting your principal residence into your trust or taking it out of your trust. It's important to note on this that this really only applies to documents that transfer title, that change the vesting toward an owner-occupant. So just because a property is owner-occupied doesn't mean that, for instance, a deed of trust for a refinance would be exempt under this particular exemption. Couple more exemptions that aren't as major or looked at really as exemptions so much in these cases, which are a document recorded in connection with a transaction where that $225 cap has already been reached, and a document that is being recorded but is not related to real estate, which isn't really the focus of these videos, being a title insurance channel. When a document is going to be exempt for any of these reasons, it has to be stated on the very front of the document, the face of the document, that it is exempt from the fee and why it is exempt from the fee. Even if the reason for the exemption is that the document is subject to documentary transfer tax, when the doc transfer tax is actually on the front of the deed, there's still the requirement for a specific statement that the document is exempted. This can be accomplished in any number of ways. It really just has to be written on the front of the deed. So it can be typed into the typed body of the deed when there's room on the front page. It can be applied as a stamp to the front of the document, or you can add a completely separate cover page to go on the front of the document that just states that it is exempt and what the reason is for the exemption. And there are templates. I can send you one you can download from the WFG website that has a checkbox, sort of check one list of the different exemptions. You can just check whichever one applies. That's super convenient and easy to read, but the thing to be careful with there is most, if not all, counties in California will add a few dollars per additional page of a document. The amount will vary from county to county, so be sure to check their fee schedule to see what that additional charge will be on the recorder fees. Still a lot less than $75, but you can avoid those few extra dollars by working it into an existing page of the document somehow. Those are the exceptions, and between those and the content of the rule itself, that's mostly all you need to know about SB2. Our next section, our last section, will just be a few different example cases to see how it might apply in actual practice. So to help put it all together, I've written out a few examples of when SB2 might be applied, when it might not have to be applied, and what those different situations are, just as general examples. Our first one is the sale of any piece of real property. And that's going to be exempt because, like I mentioned, you are exempt from paying the fee if the document is subject to documentary transfer tax or recorded in connection with the document subject to DTT. And that describes a sale. Documentary transfer tax is due upon the sale of a property for value. Next example is documents connected to the sale, which I think we pretty well covered in that last one. No SB2 charge for those. Next will be a refinance that, per some lenders' requirements, requires a deed out of the owner's trust, and then the deed of trust itself, and a deed back into the owner's trust. And so if the property is not owner-occupied in this example, then that's going to be a $225 SB2 fee because we have 3 different documents all being recorded in connection with that transaction. $75 each, 3 times 75 makes the $225. If the property is owner-occupied, you can set it up so those 3 documents would only total $75 because the deeds into and out of the trust would be covered by the exemption for transferring a residential dwelling to an owner-occupant. Now, a variation on this, if we're looking at non-owner occupied property, would be what if you're coming out of the trust and then recording a deed of trust and assignment of rents and then going back into the trust. Like I've mentioned, the deed of trust and assignment of rents is 2 different documents for the purpose of this law, but that fee is still going to be only $225 because they're all being recorded in connection with the same transaction, and there's that $225 cap that stops the charge from jumping to $375 or to $300. 4 times 75 would be 300. I was thinking up to the next example, which would be the gift of a bundle of 5 parcels of land on one deed. Like I've mentioned, even though they're on the same deed, each parcel is looked at differently. So that could go up to 5 times the 75 for $375. Now, further complicating matters, some counties kind of apply some ambiguity in the law a little bit differently on a county-by-county basis. So in that example, the grantor or grantee should be prepared to pay the full $375, but some counties might apply the $225 cap even though they're 5 separate parcels. Some counties might still look at that as 5 separate transactions, but some counties might consider it just one, in which case they would limit that charge to only $225. Our next example is the addition of a spouse to the couple's principal residence. Because they both live there, the spouse would be an owner-occupant, so we have the transfer of a residential dwelling to an owner-occupant, which is exempt, so no charge under SB2. Our final example is a spouse adding another spouse to their investment property. And that one will be a $75 charge for SB2 on their grant deed or their quitclaim, because what matters here isn't that they're married to one another. What matters is whether or not the dwelling is being transferred to an owner-occupier. And in this case, the answer there is no. Hopefully these have been helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to hit up will4title.com/contact, find out how to get in touch with me. I'd be happy to help with whatever I can. I'm Will Gray. Thanks for watching.